Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Kareem Mirza. On behalf of Subterra Renewables, I will be your host and moderator for this informative webinar, in which we will discuss how to implement renewables in your developments to increase building value, future-proof operating budgets, and increase net operating income. Subterra Renewables is the largest vertically integrated end-to-end geothermal heating and cooling utility in North America. We own 66 geothermal rigs in our fleet, making us the largest operator in North America. And we continue to grow our fleet to ensure we can make the adoption of renewable heating and cooling a no-brainer for all new developments without any interference to critical path. We're in the midst of a climate crisis. To address the problem of carbon emissions, governments at various levels have introduced a carrot and stick approach to encourage the adoption of renewables. If you attended our last webinar, you heard about the amazing clean tech investment tax credits that have been announced for renewables in Canada. However, what is often left unreported is how renewables are the key to unlocking even more value from your developments. And I don't mean just investor ESG goals. Renewables increase real economics for your development. This can be in the form of avoided costs, such as avoiding upfront costs of equipment like cooling towers, chillers, boilers. But perhaps more importantly, economic value is also driven through reduction of operating budgets, complete predictability of heating and cooling costs, the elimination of costs associated with maintenance and reserves, and the avoidance of exposure to fossil fuel volatility and carbon tax. For our purpose-built friends, this means increases to your NOI, which translates to greater building value. For our condo developer friends, this means a green building that can be sold to buyers who are concerned about the environment and their checkbooks, who can have their cake and effectively eat it too, and have complete and unparalleled control of their heating and cooling costs. Now, one last point actually before I move on and introduce our speakers. I want to clearly articulate what we mean by future-proofing your building. The world is changing. The push to net zero is being felt everywhere. If your building has old fossil fuel technology, it will soon become a stranded asset, and a pending liability is growing on your balance sheet. I want to draw your attention to what is happening in New York. Local Law 97 requires multifamily homes to reduce their natural gas consumption by 40% before 2030. Likewise, an example in Ontario is the Toronto Green Standard, which continues to get stricter with each new iteration. In addition, we already know that carbon taxes will triple by 2030. This is a real problem that can only be solved with renewables, the most impactful of which is on-site geothermal heating and cooling. You can increase your building NOI today, lower your operating costs, and protect your asset for decades to come by getting off natural gas. Now, on that note, I'm proud to introduce our first speaker, Julian McNabb. Julian is Vice President at Melbourne Property Management. He's a well-known and trusted voice in the world of property management, helping buildings and condominium boards navigate their way through budgeting chaos. If you have any questions during his presentation, please note them and submit them through Zoom. I will be sure to get to all questions during the Q&A period. We're going to make sure that we put aside quite a bit of time for that, just so that you can ask our expert panelists anything you want. So on that note, Julian, over to you, sir.
Thanks very much, Kareem. We certainly do have a difficult job as managers, and that job continues to get more difficult as we move forward. Now, we're coming out of the pandemic. A lot more people, both on the rental side and the condominium side, have all been living and working from home during the pandemic, so they've really seen a lot more of what a manager does. And at the same time, it should be noted that the building infrastructure, typically when you're designing a building, you're not necessarily designing it to have people there 24/7. So for a large portion of the last 2 years, many of the projects we've managed has been 100% occupied for almost 100% of the time. So certainly that may shorten some of the lifespan and increase the strain on some of the conventional mechanical systems that we've had in place. But a couple of things that we wanted to talk about today. Certainly as a manager's job is very difficult. Most people call when they have an issue or a problem or they need help. They're not usually calling to say, great job on the hot water temperature this morning. So, one of the jobs that is quite difficult for us obviously is managing the finances of either a rental or a condominium corporation. And we want to make sure that we're streamlining our costs as much as possible. And one of the big issues that we're facing right now is that costs are increasing, but the service being provided is exactly the same. So for example, to keep your temperature or your hot water at exactly the same temperature, it now costs more than it did before, but the water's still the same temperature. So it makes it a very difficult discussion to have with the people living in the building saying, why am I paying more for the exact same service? For our investors in the condominiums and obviously in the the people living in the rental buildings, their rents may be fixed or they may be increasing, but if your costs are going up, it's very difficult to try and extract more money from those tenants. So we're finding there's challenges there, and forecasting future costs right now are becoming incredibly difficult, not just for the near future, but for the long-term future. And certainly some of those pressures that we're really seeing, construction costs today are higher. Which means obviously future capital replacement costs. This in turn affects the insurance because the asset that you're insuring is now increased in value. It's going to cost more for those, and we're also seeing premium increases. So those are going up. Utility rates are increasing. I know anyone that received a gas bill in December or January of this year probably got a shock that it went up quite a bit. And just to show, as Kareem said earlier, the volatility of the fossil fuel market and how it impacts the way we heat buildings and heat hot water in Ontario. Certainly the carbon tax, we know that that's going to be continuing to increase. And I really like that Kareem did speak about local law 97, because I do want to touch on that in the next slide. With minimum wage, most of you who are operating or living in communities right now may be aware that again on October 1st of this year, minimum wage will increase to $16.65 per hour. Again, that's going to trickle down. There's going to be increased costs. So certainly there will be a trickle down effect to HVAC maintenance costs. The people that are coming in to make sure that your mechanical systems are working as they should, starting up, shutting down chillers, things like that. And obviously we still continue to see supply chain and labor shortages. So obviously when we're seeing a shortage of labor, that means that labor that is available is increasing in cost. And in terms of supply chain, getting replacement parts for some of the mechanical systems and even just replacing them is creating challenges in terms of trying to be fiscally responsible when the costs are just really going out of control. So again, some of the challenges that we're having. So to dumb it right down, when you're forecasting for a budget, it's typically what is it going to cost over the next 12 months to run this particular community, this particular building, this particular asset. So we have to work on what were the costs previously, what were temperatures previously, and really try to forecast where you think it'll be. Particularly, you've seen in Ontario, the last 3, 4, 5 summers have been extremely hot, which means we've put a very high demand on the electricity grid. Certainly, if you look at a lot of the geothermal models, when you're reviewing your heating and cooling needs from your mechanical or your energy modeler, you may be surprised to see how much of the demand for your project is actually on the cooling side. That was certainly something I learned. I just assumed because we have -20 in the winter that requires a lot more heat, but it's actually the humidity and the extreme heat that we sometimes get in the summer that does require a lot of resources. Now, the headlines about natural gas, we did discuss that, as I mentioned, on the December and January and February, but all it takes is a big spike in rates, because when we're forecasting for the following budgets, we're looking at consumption. How much gas are we consuming? And the problem with heating and the problem with hot water is it's very habitual. People will shower for the same amount of time each day. People like their temperature set at a certain temperature. So really their consumption is going to relatively be the same. So when you have an increase in utility costs and the consumption is the same, your building is end up going to costing more. So you now need to say to those same purchasers that haven't changed the way they're living their lifestyle, all of a sudden it's going to cost more to live in this building. So local law 97. So you may be asking, why are we quoting a local law that's in New York? We're in Ontario. What's really interesting here is this is kind of like a carbon tax. It has a potential to really increase costs because not only is it being very restrictive on consumption, it actually has very strict penalties if you actually exceed the permitted amount of emissions that your building is allowed to emit. And that can become incredibly expensive. And so we know that the Toronto market does follow some of the other markets, and obviously it is a good generator of revenue for governments. But where this is really going to affect Ontario, and certainly the green standard is in effect, is that many buildings today won't be able to upgrade or replace the infrastructure they have with similar product. So this could really make it, if you're putting in a building today and you put in a conventional system, when you go to replace that system in 15 to 20 years to 30 years, depending on its estimated lifespan, it may be very difficult to do that. It may be impossible to do that. And if you are switching to electricity, there may be an issue with the grid. And if you're able to actually replace with what you had before. And certainly, again, we're still seeing, I know COVID is in the past, we like to not keep referencing it, but we've certainly seen a big shift in the labor market. So the actual people that are coming in to take care of the communities we manage, whether that's cleaning, front desk, the day-to-day services that buildings depend on, all those costs have gone up. So as managers, we're really delivering bad news to either the condominium boards or to the owners of the asset, saying it's going to cost you a lot more to run the building and provide the exact same service. So taking this into contrast, when looking at some of the communities that we manage today that do have a geothermal system in place, what's really interesting is when we're comparing it to what a conventional system uses, what are the heating and cooling requirements? So it's interesting, every time, the chiller might fail or the conventional system, the heating might go down, and all of a sudden the cost of actually sending a technician out every single time to reboot the system, get some parts, fix that part, this is in addition to the preventative maintenance costs. So we're having someone do a regular contract every month. They're coming out all the time, making sure that everything is, like taking your car for a service. The repairs and maintenance as the asset ages, it really becomes quite incredible when reviewing, reserve fund studies and looking at HVAC lifespan of 5, 10, 15 years, how much money in the later years is spent on just repairs and maintenance. It's quite high. And as I mentioned, looking at some of the future capital replacement costs, these are becoming very, very high. Again, utility costs that, they're very difficult to sort of really accurately forecast. All it takes is for a time of use or a regulated tiered pricing plan to be removed, and all of a sudden your costs are going to jump astronomically. So these are some costs that we associated specifically with heating and cooling to the central mechanical plant. So again, some of the challenges we face today. So these are buildings that we have right today that have conventional systems that rely on electricity and natural gas. Obviously, the increasing gas rates and carbon tax. I feel for the board of directors of communities that we manage today that are going to be faced with sending out budgets to their ownership saying, sorry, our costs are going up because the gas and the carbon tax is going up. Electricity rates. We know with the city of Toronto and in Ontario, there are some massive plans in the works to massively overhaul and upgrade the amount of electricity that's going to be provided to the province. Well, if we look at the city of Toronto and their massive upgrading of all the pipes that carry water to each of our homes, that cost an increase of 10% per annum over how many years, to the fact where the cost of water now is double what it was 10 years ago. So the only way we're forecasting in terms of looking for the future is the cost of electricity in this province is going to go up astronomically to pay for these infrastructure costs. Again, we're seeing insurance costs increase. So if you do need to insure your chiller from accidental failure in your boiler system, so those replacement costs are included in your current costs. Again, labor shortages. There's nothing worse than when there's a part on order and all of a sudden your chiller is down for a few weeks in the middle of July, waiting for technicians to come in and knowledgeable technicians. So we're still seeing some challenges there. And overall, increase in costs and inflation. They're putting some real pressure on budgets today. Again, getting the same service but for a higher cost. So what are the challenges we see in the future? well, obviously increased replacement costs. If you're saving up for a car and the cost of that car goes up astronomically, it's going to take you either longer to save up for that car, or you have to start saving more for the car. Now, most people don't have the luxury of putting off buying that car. They need to buy it when their old car has died because they need to use that to get to work or what have you. So, the increased replacing cost is making it challenging. Changes to the building code. So you may not be able to put in what you have today. You may need to upgrade your system to put in, for example, you may need to have an electrical system. You may need to retrofit with something very different, which could put additional strain on your electrical infrastructure. So with that, you've got now electricity loads and infrastructure problems. The impact of EV charging right now. So if you need to upgrade your transformer, in addition to the demands on electric vehicle charging to accommodate a central mechanical plant that's now using electricity to provide your heat, that could be that's a whole other cost unassociated with the central mechanical plant. And again, this is very tied to restrictions in the gas use. You may not be able to continue using natural gas. We know that is a government goal. They've set the goalpost. I think it's 2040. They don't want to have any gas or systems that are, for mechanical systems that you're looking at today in 2023 for projects that you may be delivering in the next 5 years. You're getting very close to the lifespan of the current infrastructure being installed, not being able to be replaced after 2040. And one other point that I really do want to stress is a recent actuary report that was done by the industry, which looked at the incredible growth that Ontario has experienced, which is fantastic. It does make Toronto one of the #1 cities in the world to live. There's a lot of construction going on. We do have some housing issues, but because of the boom all happening at the same time, assuming that everybody's mechanical systems all have the same estimated lifespan, which means everybody's going to be replacing that equipment at the exact same time. And that can only lead to, again, further shortages of trades, qualified skills to install and replace this equipment. And it is going to lead to a shortage of systems to be able to put in because of the increased demand. So these are some things for the future that we're really looking at. It's great to forecast what it's going to cost to run your building over the next 30 years. But I think there's going to be some real bumps in the road where if you're putting in a system today, it's going to be significantly more expensive in years 20 and 30 when you need to start really capturing and accounting for the future replacement cost of your mechanical systems. And finally, I just want to touch on climate change. The last 5 years, we've seen condominiums consume more electricity purely because of the increased amount of heat. When we have the polar vortex, when it gets to -40, you're using incredible amounts of gas just to get you going there. So, as the climate change swings as much as it does, we are seeing that impact, and we can only see that's going to impact it more in the future. So obviously the benefit that we're seeing for some of the communities we manage that do have geothermal is it's taking a lot of the guesswork out. It's a fixed fee every month. It doesn't matter if gas goes up or down with respect to your central, the suite, or the heating and cooling that's consumed within each suite. It really helps stabilize it. We don't have ups and downs. So obviously if you've got a shoulder season where it might not be too hot for air conditioning and it may not be too cool for heating, you're not using as much utilities, but you're seeing a big wave. And typically most condominiums will collect the funds that they need to operate their community monthly. Most rental operators will charge a monthly rent. So your cash flow is month dependent. And the beauty of the geothermal is that it's a monthly fee. So the fee is paid as the cash comes in, as opposed to in some instances where we had, like last winter, we have a huge spike in gas, but you don't have a huge spike in the fees that are coming in to pay for that gas. So it can be really difficult to challenge that. I know certainly when it comes to assisting with the influx of consumption, that Peter's going to touch on that and the importance of sub-metering. So at least that way the in-suite consumption and the costs associated with that can be made more accountable by the residents or the tenants in the end. And certainly that's certainly something that we feel very strongly about. Is the in-suite metering of heating and cooling from a management and an operation standpoint. By having this nice trend of stabilized cost, it really helps avoid the boards. And again, in a condominium, the boards are volunteers. They're not paid for their time. And if they have to make the very difficult conversation to either increase fees or send out a special assessment to pay for the shortfall because the cost of replacing a chiller or a boiler or a heating and cooling system has increased exponentially, completely not their fault, that makes them deeply unpopular. And by not having these costs, we certainly see an increased return on investment. You know, the number one thing we have real estate agents when we're doing sessions on return on investment is we set our rents, and often we have 2-year agreements, and in year 2 or 3 the fees really go up to operate the building, which reduces our return on investment, which we don't see as big an impact with geothermal heating and cooling. And this goes to the point that 80 to 85% of the condominiums in downtown Toronto, from what we're seeing, are often tenanted. And we know this because when we do status certificates for anyone who's looking at buying or refinancing, we have to disclose. And when you rent out your unit, you have to tell management if the unit's rented. So we have these hard statistics. We know that the Tenancy Act makes it very difficult to increase your rent. So that's obviously another cost that's going on. And the only way we can really sort of increase our return on investment when it comes to utilities is reducing the consumption of utilities. And by replacing utilities, which are volatile, with the heating and cooling, it's made our jobs a lot easier. Finally, I just want to talk about the manager's time. You know, when you're living in a condominium or you're living in a rental building, trying to get a hold of the manager, and you know, if you've got an issue, managers are very busy. You know, they wear very many hats. They're a coordinator of service. And the other cost that I was looking at when I was preparing for this presentation was, wow, how much time are our managers spending with the mechanical plants? You know, if it's not working properly, they're taking contractors up there, they're calling them on the phone saying, this is the issue, I'm not sure if you can help me. And all of a sudden with the geothermal, a lot of that conversation's gone. We don't have to worry about the chiller and when are we going to winterize it and when are we going to turn it over from heating to cooling and it's really freed up a lot of the time. So in addition to the cool factor, in addition to feeling good about working in a community that's using renewable energy, and you know, you can tell, oh, yeah, my building's helping the environment where, you know, we are consuming a lot less. It really does help free up the manager's time so they can actually focus on some of the more important issues on a building. So certainly there was some unexpected benefits to what we're seeing when buildings are utilizing geothermal heating and cooling systems.
Thank you, Julian. That was great. That was wonderful. Very informative. And every time I think about what happened over the last few years with natural gas prices, I can only imagine what the managers must have gone through. So thank you for that. And, you know, all the more power to the folks that manage these things in your firm. So on that note, our next speaker is Peter R.J. Mills. Peter is the CEO of Wise Meter Solutions. Wise is the industry leader in sub-metering and billing solutions for multifamily and other mixed-use developments. Peter and his team have helped many a development unlock the value of renewables by showing them how to recover the value from residents in a fair and transparent manner. Peter, the floor is yours, sir.
Thanks very much, Kareem, and Julian, thank you for your presentation as well. It's a lot of good information there. Really, my portion of this presentation is to focus in on improving the net operating income of the suite or the building itself, and try to help identify what various billing options are available to owners and developers in terms of a framework, outline some of the considerations you should look at in terms of overall sub-metering and billing options, walk through a typical billing program, outline some of the benefits, look at some of the financial impacts of sub-metering for utilities in buildings, and look at some of the average costs as well. So you can get a real sense of what the impact is of ensuring that residents are paying for what they use. And that's really what it comes down to, is making sure you've got those people that are using the utilities are the ones that are paying for it. That makes the most sense. We've, there's certainly a large body of evidence now that illustrates that sub-metering of utilities depending on the utility type, can generate upwards of 40% savings between non-bill payers. So there's no question, we'd like to sometimes consider our education program, where residents are receiving a monthly bill, so they know exactly how much they're using each month, and they always are using less. So that's an important thing to consider when you look at geothermal, is to ensure that residents are aware of the building and how it's being cooled and heated, and ensure that they are being allocated those costs correctly, so that they can at least change their behavior and take ownership of becoming an energy manager for their own unit. And that's what really at the end of the day drives savings. And I think it's also important, you've got all these residents that are using, call it 50% of the energy in the building, but there's, obviously the owners and managers of these buildings have an equal amount of responsibility to ensure their buildings are as efficient as possible, and they're using as much green technology as possible in the design and build and operation of the assets. A little bit about the geothermal strategy. So obviously the housing sector is heavily regulated, whether it's condominium or rental and rental tenancy across Canada. And the utility and billing side of this equation is also heavily regulated. There are different types of regulation coast to coast across Canada. We see on the municipal side, probably 300 different types of regulations associated with water and water billing. Every province has its own set of regulations around submetering. And then the federal government also has its own set of regulations around metering equipment and how it's to be used. So there is a lot of regulatory oversight in the utility billing side, specifically as it relates to residents. So building owners and developers can certainly engage with a third party to provide residents with a geothermal fee. Typically, we're seeing roughly 50% of the geothermal costs, or the costs of heating and cooling, would be in suite, and about half is in common areas. So when we're applying our geothermal fee to a resident bill, we're typically recovering 50% of that monthly geothermal fee that's being collected from the residents on their monthly bill. And it's key that that fee is excluded from rent, and allows the flexibility for that recovery to be escalated over time as the geothermal rates increase and other utility rates increase. And typically what we've seen, and Julian certainly touched on this in terms of water rates, but most utilities are increasing at a much, much faster pace over time than rents. And certainly the ability to recover utility costs in the month that those increases happen is an important way for owners and managers to manage their budgeting and expense management within the building. Typically our submetering agreements and with the residents are being applied to new tenants only. You can convert sitting tenants to become bill payers, but those agreements have to be mutually agreed to between both the resident and the owner. So we have done projects where sitting tenants have become, or sitting residents have become bill payers, but they've also received a compensation from the owner in order to make that conversion. The other thing that we're seeing is certainly Measurement Canada in 2019 brought out an energy standard for thermal metering. So there's now a federal technology standard for thermal metering. And as geothermal becomes more and more prevalent in the market, I wouldn't be surprised if there's further regulatory, oversight, which I think is important to ensure that there's a complete fairness being applied to residents and owners and the geothermal community, to make sure that it's in line with other utility codes as well. So I anticipate there may be additional future oversight, and we're certainly ready for that. So in terms of the billing strategy, obviously you're, as owners and developers, you're looking at geothermal options early in the design stage. And it's an important factor to look at the billing strategy for residents at this stage as well, so that you can get a better sense of your pro forma as you're building that out, and what the recoveries from the residents would be as part of the overall financial billing package. So you want to make sure you're making that decision as early as possible to sort of maximize your return on the geothermal fees. Again, the fees for geothermal are set as a monthly recurring fee on the resident bill. And what we want to ensure is that geothermal fee is less, obviously, than what the business as usual operating case would be. So typically in a geothermal application, there's an in-suite heat pump. And so we're metering the electricity use on that heat pump. We're metering all of the electricity use in addition to that in the suite. We're also metering the cold water and hot water. And we've also started to see an increase in owners and managers that are looking to provide a different rate for the hot water consumption, again, to help offset some of those geothermal fees. So as those geothermal costs are being applied to domestic hot water, we can also help recover some of those geothermal costs through a in-suite hot water rate. And about 80 to 90% of the water use in most new multi-residential buildings is in-suite. So it can be a good source of recovery of some of those additional geothermal fees. And then the other thing we do is we match the geothermal contract terms on the rate increases that are being applied to the resident bill, so that we're obviously mitigating any future rate increases, not only on the geothermal side, but submetering obviously mitigates perfectly any rate increases for in-suite energy use, whether it be electricity or water. So it's a perfect hedge against any rate increases. Doesn't really matter which utility you're looking at. So really, what we like to look at is really one utility bill for residents. Certainly in Ontario, it's mandatory that all new construction sites are metered for electricity, whether it's through submetering or direct metering. And we look at a number of other services that are typically and can be included on a resident bill, and we focus in on the utility type services. Certainly geothermal is one of those, certainly seen as a utility and can be paid like a utility. Electricity and water, obviously internet, and some other clients have even asked us to look at adding on some additional sort of amenity services on as a separate line item on the bill. Again, allowing the residents to see exactly what they're using and paying for each month, whether it's geothermal or other utility costs. It's an important piece of the education that goes on for residents. If all of these fees are included in rent or their common element fees each month, they don't necessarily understand or see their consumption. So putting it onto a bill, showing them the measurement amount, and it's a great education and certainly drives conservation across the building. So in terms of the geothermal strategy, the few areas that I wanted to touch on to follow up that Julian had mentioned. Ontario Power Generation is they currently have a sort of installed capacity in the province of about 22,000 megawatts of peak power supply. They anticipate, with the decarbonization and electrification of buildings and transportation, by 2050, they're anticipating they're going to need to nearly triple the total generation capacity in the province to about 60,000 megawatts. So essentially what they've built in the last 100 years, they're going to need to build twice as much of that in the next 25 or 30 years. They've got they have a long horizon, but they have a lot of work to get at. And that generation capacity is going to come from small modular nuclear reactors, refurbishment of nuclear reactors, expansion of large transmission grids across the province, as well as investing into larger hydroelectric dams, and obviously some renewables as well. Solar and wind will play a part of that. Those are really large costs, and each of the utilities, as Julian mentioned, are also investing enormous amounts of money to deliver this electricity to our neighborhoods and making extensive infrastructure upgrades. So all of those costs are not going to be paid for free. They are going to come from rate increases, and there's no question that utility rates are going to continue to escalate. And now is the time, as owners and developers, to be really focused on efficiency within the buildings, driving down sort of the load profile as best as you can, making the buildings as efficient as possible, looking at what are the best ways to use renewables, and geothermal is an excellent technology for reducing carbon emissions in the buildings, allowing you to promote a net zero building. And we're now working with a number of developers that are building net zero buildings, which is great to see. And if they can do that now, anyone that's planning for future builds should 100% be looking to drive down to a full net zero, or as close to it as possible. And if you can't get to net zero, there is already becoming quite an active carbon credit market, where you'll be able to go and buy carbon offsets if you do have any outstanding emissions. They're not going to be cheap, but it will allow you to get down to net zero by offsetting those last final emissions with carbon credits. The other good thing about the billing strategy is certainly resident satisfaction, and allowing residents to focus on their own energy use, not having to worry about what their neighbors are using and why they should be paying for their neighbors' overuse. And they also get a single bill with all their utilities on it, so it keeps it simple and easy for them. It reduces the workload from the management team, and certainly Julian mentioned this, it allows managers to focus on what they do best, which is running, operating, and maintaining the properties and the amenity spaces, and ensuring that, you know, residents are focused on their own utility use within their suite. And then as your portfolio grows and other services come online, there may be additional products and services that can also be put onto the resident bill each month, again, focused on utility use. Maybe there's access to backup battery storage or battery offsets, again, in the future, about managing the load profile in the building to ensure that you're optimizing your the electrification of the building, but making sure that you're optimizing the load profile in your building as well. Just some details. So typically what we're seeing in properties, roughly 50%, and depending on how much electrification is being used in suite, we've seen some properties that are using air source heat pumps, for example, and not necessarily tied to geothermal. That in-suite electricity percentage can go up as high as 75%. And again, that's another really good positive impact from the geothermal technology, is it does keep the overall load profile down in the building, and puts a lot of efficiency into the ground. And it's a great way of managing the overall scale of electricity in your building. As I mentioned earlier, water is about 90% in suite, and it's certainly hot water, you know, is a big component of energy use. So the ability to recapture that hot water cost and the cost of heating that hot water is another important part of the overall geothermal billing strategy. And then thermal energy use, roughly about 50% of it is in suite. So again, the ability to recapture those costs through sub-metering and directly drive a better net operating income for the property is what, you know, the biggest benefit for sure in for property owners and managers as it relates to sub-metering. And that's it. Turn it back over to you, Kareem.
Thank you, Peter. We truly are very fortunate for your company's leadership in helping unlock the value of renewables, and by making adoption so simple and so straightforward. So thank you again for that. That was wonderful. Now, For our final speaker, unfortunately, Paulina Barnes on our team is not feeling well. So I will try my utmost to put on my best Paulina Barnes and take you through her slides. I promise to be very quick, so we leave a lot of time for Q&A. So we're going to go through the Subterra's energy as a service utility model for geothermal heating and cooling, but just a few quick words about Subterra, just to expand upon what I said earlier. Again, we are the largest fully vertically integrated geothermal heating and cooling utility in the US and Canada. We have 66 rigs in our fleet. By the end of the year, we will have close to 100. We have over 250 employees ranging from drill operators, field engineers, mechanical engineers, energy modelers, financial modeling experts, asset managers, operations, and maintenance providers. We are vertically integrated for a reason. We want the path to net zero, a net zero future, to be completely without resistance. We do not interfere with a new development's critical path, and we can commit to timelines because we own the rigs. We confidently guarantee the operations of our projects because all design, modeling, and monitoring is done in-house. We stand behind our projects for the entire lifespan because we are geothermal heating and cooling experts. So as North America's premier distributed geothermal heating and cooling utility, we deliver clean, renewable heating and cooling to our customers. So how does geothermal work? Across the globe, within plus minus 1 to 2 degrees, the Earth is 55 degrees Fahrenheit, below a depth of, call it 200 to 300 feet. We use the Earth as a giant thermal energy storage system, like a battery. In the summertime, we reject heat into the ground and extract cooling through a heat exchange process. In the wintertime, we extract heat from the Earth to use for space heating. Geothermal is the only renewable heating and cooling solution that, theoretically can last forever, as long as it is managed correctly. There is no problematic manufacturing process. There is no question about the environmental impact of disposal. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge, I'm referring to solar and batteries. This is as natural a solution, I should say, as can exist. We are literally using the Earth for our heating and cooling needs. Cannot be depleted, and it can be used indefinitely as long as the thermal battery system is properly balanced. We specialize in the management of the geothermal heating and cooling system and ensure that the giant thermal battery is well balanced, even when taking into account changing climate conditions. So when we talk about energy as a service, what do we mean? But actually, before I get into that particular model, just a few more points on why are we tackling things like this? Why does this even matter? So in urban centers, buildings contribute up to 60% of greenhouse gas emissions. This is because heating is typically achieved by burning fossil fuels. Also, many electricity grids are also powered by fossil fuels. Ontario's pretty clean. Around 27% of Ontario's capacity is natural gas fired, but that's not the case everywhere. If you look at many other jurisdictions within our fine country, you do have still folks burning coal and a lot of gas being used for electricity generation. So this makes air conditioning in the summertime also a major polluting source. Geothermal eliminates all this. We can eliminate nearly all greenhouse gas emissions from a building by providing heating and cooling from the Earth. Geothermal also unlocks additional space in the building, since you are now eliminating the need for conventional heating and cooling equipment, since the new source of heating and cooling is literally underneath your building. Also, as you heard from our earlier speakers, it increases the value of a building today. It also makes the building future-proof, as I mentioned earlier. The development is now immune to carbon taxes, fossil fuel volatility, net zero rules, green standards, or self-imposed ESG goals, since it's already heated and cooled from a renewable source. So a little bit about our model. Subterra's energy as a service model, also what we also call our utility model, it removes all upfront costs associated with the adoption of renewable geothermal heating and cooling. Subterra designs, builds, owns, operates, and maintains the geothermal heating and cooling system for the building for a term of up to 50 years. We are the utility provider, making sure the system operates correctly. We take on all responsibility for proper operation of the system, including any mechanical components such as pumps and heat exchangers or heat pumps. We structure our utility offering such that the residents are paying less than, or at the very least equal to, the cost of conventional fossil fuel heating and cooling today. That's very important to note, because obviously it takes 3 to 4 years for any given building to be up and running. We're coming in well in advance, right, to design our systems and to put holes in the ground. But we need to make sure that, we're comfortable that folks are not out of pocket. They are not paying more. We're not hurting their checkbooks when we're asking folks to go green. Our core principle is to ensure that the adoption of geothermal heating and cooling does not cost more than conventional heating and cooling, and to eliminate any barriers to adoption, such as high upfront system costs. And just a little bit about to show how creative we could be in our value proposition, depending on our clients. Purpose-built rental developers who are also long-term owners typically do not want a third party running their utilities and their developments. We get it. So to solve this problem, when it comes to the adoption of geothermal, we've created our joint ownership model. It's exactly the same as our energy as a service utility model, except that we allow the developer to invest in the project up to 50%. Subterra will guarantee all the operations, maintenance, and reserves exactly the same way as we would do in the utility model, such that our co-investor is not affected by any cost overruns. We backstop all the risk. And most important of all, we operate the geothermal heating and cooling system. We do what we are experts at, while ensuring that our purpose-built developer friends retain a comfortable level of ownership over the asset that is providing heating and cooling to their building. Operating savings, when we design, I'm going to touch upon this briefly since I mentioned it, but I think this is important to note. When we design our geothermal heating and cooling systems, our target is to be 10% below the cost of conventional heating and cooling. That's out of the gate every single time. That's what we're trying to target. But what we mean by this is when you add up all the costs associated with conventional heating and cooling, such as commodity costs for natural gas and electricity, makeup water costs, maintenance costs, capital reserves, we want our charge to be below that. And as a principle, we limit our offering to only those projects where we can add value, or at the very least, be the same cost as conventional heating and cooling. We always want to ensure that our customers have real economic value from our geothermal heating and cooling utility projects. We believe it should be easy to adopt renewables, and so we've made it easy. On top of all this, we haven't even talked about what happens to the 30% investment tax credits that have been announced by the government. Since we make the costs of our systems work without the ITC, we can then use it to further reduce our system costs and even add more value to our customers. Some of the developer friends hearing this may not want us to do that. They may want to keep that. We can talk about that, but more importantly, what I'm trying to show over here is a lot of flexibility in this regard. And ideally, we are adding value every single time, above and beyond every step of the way to our developers. What I'm trying to illustrate over here is that we make our numbers work without the ITC. It is simply a sweetener that we want to pass on along the value chain down to whoever it is that's ultimately being benefited by the system. We promote adoption at no upfront cost, lower operating costs, and now with the ITCs, we can even further reduce operating costs to make this the most attractive value proposition for heating and cooling, period. So just a few very quick notes on our risk-free guarantees. When we design our system, we need to come to site and drill a test borehole and conduct a thermal conductivity test. If for whatever reason, the test borehole or the TC test yield disappointing results, we bear full responsibility and absorb any costs associated with our feasibility assessment. In other words, we're taking on all the risk. You are never out of pocket. When we finalize our renewable energy fee, after all of the detailed engineering and the test borehole and all that good stuff is done, which is our renewable energy fee, by the way, is the annual fee we charge for heating and cooling. It is 100% guaranteed and cannot change, regardless of budget overruns or any other issues that may come up during construction for us. We are the experts at geothermal heating and cooling, and we stand behind our commitments. So last but not least, we do get asked this all the time. When should I be talking to you about geothermal at our new development? In other words, at what point should we be engaging Subterra, for example, to come in and discuss geothermal or the applicability of geothermal at a building? The answer is anytime, but ideally before you break ground. And the reason for that is we never want to interfere with your critical path. We're going to come in and put all of the holes in the ground that is needed to provide geothermal heating and cooling to your building. We're going to establish the bore fields even before you have performed any excavation whatsoever to the site. And we're going to do that well in advance because, not to beat a dead horse over here, but we own all the rigs. We do prefer, however, that you contact us from the very beginning, as early as your due diligence phase, because even before zoning has taken place. And the reason for that is we can do desktop studies to tell you right away if we can offer our energy as a service utility model and add value, just so that we're not interfering. Like, if you have to pivot away for whatever reason, it's never happened, but just in case, we can ensure that we are doing that very expeditiously. We can also make sure that geothermal is included in your design, which, and this is very important, in some cities like Toronto, actually expedites the approvals process. I'm going to say that again. If geothermal is included in your design in Toronto, we have been told by the city that it will expedite your approval process. So I look forward, I should be saying Paulina looks forward to this, but we all look forward to this. We look forward to helping you incorporate our geothermal heating and cooling utility at your future development. So on that note, though, we are done with Subterra slides. I really do want to move into Q&A. Folks, I realize that we only have 5 more minutes booked in this, but for those who want to stick around, we can go into this as long as both Peter and Julian are amenable, because there are quite a few questions that have come up and I do want to get to all of them. So Peter and Julian, I'm going to start taking these questions and putting it out to both of you, but I think I'll just point out to the person that I think it's most geared towards. So let's start off with, there's a question regarding geothermal in dense residential neighborhoods and any projects where you can install bore fields and parkades. When green space isn't available or accessible to a drill, how much does that drive up costs? I guess this is to neither you. I'll quickly answer that question. On a retrofit basis, if you have land that you control or is otherwise accessible adjacent to the building, we can come into that land and we can go ahead and drill. It doesn't really increase cost that much because at that point, the conditions are very good. However, we are in the process right now, and this will be available within the next 4 to 6 months. We're in the process right now. We're in R&D with a drill co, a designer company, to go ahead and produce low headroom rigs that we can then bring in, low headroom and low noise rigs that we can bring into P3s, call it, or P2s, and very dense structures and perform the drilling right from like the bottommost part of the building. That stay tuned for. It doesn't quite exist, and it doesn't exist right now in the world of geothermal heating and cooling, but we will be proudly putting that on display in the next 4 to 6 months. I do have a question geared towards Peter. You had mentioned that the question is that Peter, that you had mentioned that the split between electricity, the split on the geothermal side, the split between what the residents pay and what the common elements pay is 50%. Question is for you, if the geothermal was not included, what do those splits normally look like? I guess in other words, if I were to summarize the question, is geothermal are you only able to recover 50% of geothermal from the residents? What if the residents use more? How are you addressing that?
Yeah, that's a good question. On the specific geothermal monthly cost, because we're not actually able to put a meter on the incoming geothermal cost. So we can allocate that cost based on suite type, square footage of the suite. You can go into a much deeper calculation in terms of square footage and population of the unit as well. But typically the flat fee is a fair allocation based on the overall building design. And that 50% can vary a little bit, obviously, based on the size of the amenities, common areas, any mixed use within the building. And so that all has to be calculated up front before the flat fee is determined for the geothermal recovery.
There's a question that's actually related to this. I'm going to read it word for word. I would like to draw attention that condo management companies are charging a significant additional condo fee to cover the geothermal energy. So owners, residents are not getting a significant benefit of applying the system. Moreover, when leasing the condo unit, the owner is not able to charge the tenant for the full amount of the condo fee increase. Otherwise, the tenant may choose to rent at another building in which condo monthly fees are lower. This is a very interesting question. Peter or Julian, either of you? Or
I'll
perhaps
let Julian take the phase one of that.
Yeah, I think it's probably a two-part answer. It really depends. So a condominium's not able to charge an extra fee. The thing about metering that's very important is when you live in a condominium, it's either a common expense, so it's a condominium fee, it's a maintenance fee, it's a common element assessment is what it's called, or it's separate, which would be metered. So if it's not metered and it's not measured, then typically it would be a common expense. So, initially technology has increased significantly in the last 10 years. I would say 10 years ago, we really weren't in a stage where the BTU joule thermal meters were really readily available. They were very expensive. They were only really used in Europe where energy costs were significantly higher. So the cost of geothermal was typically included in the common expenses. So that monthly fee, while it was still fixed and it only increased by the contract percentage rate, you weren't able to pass that cost on outside of the common expense. So the owner of the asset would pay that cost. If it is separately metered, I know there was another question in the panel on charging extra, and I think that was a fixed dollar amount, not a cost per square foot amount. That's more on the line of what Peter was discussing, where if there's a bill that comes to the resident or the owner and the owner's leased it out, the owner, that's a contractual arrangement between the owner of the unit and the tenant that's occupying the unit, if they're going to be responsible for paying those in-suite consumption of utilities. So to my knowledge, an extra fee, it would be most unusual because again, the Condominium Act is consumer protection legislation, and it's very clear about how common expenses can be charged to owners and what can be charged to owners.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. We've never seen certainly a condominium management company adding an additional fee on the geothermal. Certainly it can be included in the common area cost, but not an additional cost by the condo management company. Obviously any metered utility, immediately when there's a rate change or a rate increase, that rate gets immediately passed on to the resident in the month that rate increase happens. And similarly, if residents are using more or less, they benefit from their conservation activities. So we certainly see a very wide range of energy use, certainly electricity use. It's not uncommon to see a 10-fold difference between the lowest user in a building and the highest user. Funnily enough, typically the most conservation minded tenants are the ones that are most interested in looking at their bill each month and ensuring it's perfectly accurate. So the more energy managers we have in the building, I think the more efficient the building is going to be running.
Thank you both. And just if I were to sum it up, just maybe a little differently, it sounds like there's more than one way to go ahead and pass on the cost of geothermal heating and cooling to residents, whether it's owner occupied or tenant occupied. And I mean, Peter, your entire presentation was about this. It can be fairly metered. It can be passed on appropriately. It doesn't all need to be part of a fixed fee or whatever. There are several means by which to do that. So I think, thank you both for that answer. I think that was very important to note. This is more of a technical question, I think, Peter. I don't know if this will change your answer at all, but Peter, I'm just going to read the question as is. Peter mentioned that most geo buildings use in-suite heat pumps. What about when it's a fan coil system? Does that change anything? So if I were to summarize that, in other words, you meant, I think what this is referring to is you had mentioned that in geothermal energy, geothermal heating and cooling buildings, that you see an uptick in the cost of the resident usage of electricity, and if that would change at all, or how that would be metered in the case of let's say a fan coil system where it's more like a centralized heat pump.
Mhm. Well, I mean, a fan coil unit typically doesn't have a compressor in it, so it doesn't use as much electricity. Heat pumps have a compressor in it, which is the real reason why it makes them more efficient. So certainly heat pumps use more in-suite electricity. Fan coil units, we're typically putting in 1 or 2 thermal meters directly into the fan coil unit itself, and using Measurement Canada approved thermal meters to measure the actual energy being used by those in-suite fan coil units. But those are typically being tied to a gas-fired boiler, which again is from a future state, not where we want to see buildings being generated or being built. So that's sort of the answer on fan coil. Is there's we can adapt a geothermal or a thermal meter directly into the fan coil unit. We work with fan coil manufacturers to achieve that.
I think that's great. There's a follow-on question to that, or a question I think is deeply related, and that is, what costs are included in the geothermal cost portion of the built to tenants?
So typically when we're, particularly on a condominium side, and it would be applicable on a rental side as well, you have to determine, there's a rate that's created, and often that will be determined based on the developer's either energy model, or there's usually a mechanical engineer that will estimate, to Peter's point, the consumption of in-suite versus common area, and that will sort of work out a percentage. So let's just say, this particular building that is going to use 70% of the geothermal will be in suite. So that 70% is then apportioned to in suite, and based on some of the thermal meters that we're seeing being installed in the projects where we manage today that have geothermal and have thermal meters, that 60% is then apportioned based on how much actual energy each of the units are consuming. So it's quite a good system, and if the board needs to make tweaks to that, because essentially the condominium or the rental owner has the ability to choose to make sure that it's fair and equitable, and make it a transferable process, because you can go to the City of Toronto website and you can find out what the cost of a kilowatt of electricity is, and I can go to the City of Toronto website and I can look at how much a cost of 1,000 liters of water is going to cost, but I can't go and look up how much a BTU unit of energy is going to cost. I can't look at how much a joule of geothermal energy is going to cost. So these are decisions that are often made by the ownership or the board of directors in a condo, to make sure that it is a fair and equitable process.
That's very interesting, Peter, Julian. So it sounds to me like whether there's geothermal energy included or not, at the end of the day, they're not metering for thermal energy, and as a result, that cost doesn't need to be passed on one way or other, and it needs to be done. Ultimately, it's a decision for management, whether that's condo management or the management of, or the owners, I should say, of a purpose-built building. It's very good. There's a question, I guess, for Subterra, so I'll field that. How many years does the bore field last, and how are boreholes repaired if they malfunction? So there is, if you read any resource regarding the lifespan of a geothermal energy field, geothermal heating and cooling energy exchange field, most folks will peg it at 100 plus. They'll call it 100 plus years. The reason they say that is, at the end of the day, it's not actually generating any heat. Okay, I think this is a big misnomer that needs to be well understood. The ground that we are drilling into, up to 1,000 feet, it's a storage facility. You got to think about it that way. The ground is at all times about 55 degrees plus minus 1 degree from the South Pole to the North Pole, but it's not being used. It's not like geothermal power. It's not being used to generate heating or cooling. It's more a heat exchange process. So we're using the ground as a thermal battery to put a lot of thermal energy into, in the case of the summer, and extract it in the case of the winter. So when things go wrong, it's because they're not being operated correctly. That folks have this mentality with geothermal that you set it and forget it. And it's very much the analogy of a very slow moving car crash. Like it's a car crash where if you were driving straight into a wall, it may take you 10 years to hit it. So at every given point, there's a lot of time to go ahead and fix things. And how do you fix things? Well, you fix it by balancing out the system, changing flow rates, and worst case scenario, literally adding additional heating or cooling into the ground through an external source in order to balance out the field. So in other words, if operated correctly, I mean, this lasts indefinitely. If operated incorrectly, you're going to be in a situation where the thermal battery is either completely depleted or completely charged. And then what you need to do is balance it out by bringing an external source in to fix the problem. And these are things that, of course, we're very well versed in, that we do. We actually are purchasers of distressed assets. But for our existing assets, our own, we do all of the management in-house, and we're never thinking, what about next summer or next winter? We're thinking 5 years out, 10 years out, 30 years out, in order to ensure that the design, as well as the ongoing operations and management of the geothermal heating and cooling field, is well maintained. There's a question about, this is not about geothermal heating and cooling, but it is about renewables in general. It's regarding batteries. So I'm gonna read the question as is. We are near our max for our supply from hydro. We see more hydro needs for electrical charging of cars and now heating. And this is in the case of obviously electrified heating. With the new low overnight rates coming, are batteries becoming an option? What about using batteries to not having to upgrade electrical systems? Is this economical? Is there a way to not have to upgrade our electrical supply? So I'm just going to summarize the question. It's like, as an option, is our batteries, literally battery energy storage system, electrical batteries, are they an option for perhaps doing load shifting behavior, such that a building is charging at night and discharging during peak hours? And is it also an option to go ahead and perhaps avoid very expensive infrastructure upgrades that a building may require if they're going to go ahead and electrify their boilers? So, I mean, either of you can take this. I do have a little bit of experience in this regard. We do have some experience at Subterra with batteries at some of our projects. So I can tell you this, when it comes to Ontario specifically, the problem that you're going to run into, there are two problems. One is that your battery's got to be very big for a high-rise building or even a mid-rise building, right? So the question always is, where are you going to put it, right? Are you going to put it on the rooftop? When you're thinking about a battery of that size, you got to be thinking about sea containers, like these 40, 50-foot containers that are on sea vessels. So how do you get it there? They're very heavy. They could be in the range of 10 to 15, sometimes 20,000 pounds, depending on how much is being put there. So you have structural concerns, but putting all of that aside, if you're going to put a battery in your building, you need to make sure that the grid is aware of this. You cannot actually put a battery behind the meter without making the grid aware. And the grid, when they're judging whether or not they can, the availability of resources to support a battery, they're not judging that at off-peak hours. They're judging that at peak hours. So what they're saying is, on a worst case scenario basis, are you going ahead and charging your batteries during peak hours? And do I have enough infrastructure to support that? As a result, we see, at least in urban cores and such, and in dense areas, battery applications fail time and again. Now, you could argue, for example, that, well, that's stupid. I can put controls in place and ensure this will never charge during peak hours, only during off-peak hours. This is a this is a bit of a structural problem, a systemic problem with how these things are managed in Ontario. So I'm sure at some point in the near future, they're going to change some of these rules and open up that possibility. But as it stands right now, it's just, given the existing rules, it's just not feasible. Peter, Julian,
if we could, I can add on to that. We're always, as managers, we're always exploring new options. If there's ways that we can save costs, if there's ways we can better utilize energy and reduce consumption of energy, we're all over it. Some of the points I was going to mention, you've already covered. Like I would echo some of those comments. You know, the two biggest things is, does it make sense financially, and operationally, can it work? So even if the numbers do work, getting a crane to hoist this thing to the roof of a building, you know, if it's going to cost me $75,000 to put a battery on the roof, and we've got to cut the roof open and drop it in, you know, that the return to actually get the return on that investment, it could take 10 years. So the numbers in the long term haven't made sense. I'm not saying they don't make sense, they just haven't on the projects that we've looked at. We're hoping that that will change in the future. And the only way I think that's really going to change is with some government incentive, more government incentive to sort of help with that. It's not my area of expertise. We rely on others that we've been working with to look at those. But the batteries we're seeing today, they're increasing in technology, which is fantastic. So they are providing a better service, but that comes at an increased cost and an increased size, increased weight. The biggest issue we have is getting these into the building, putting them in a space that's convenient to actually connect into the building's infrastructure. And right now, the cost of those, just based on the savings and the lack of government incentives, have really made it a sort of a non-starter. I think definitely, to Karim's point, maybe it's a more viable option for new construction, where you've got a clean slate and you can overcome some of these obstacles. But again, if the government incentives aren't there, it's very difficult for you to charge those additional costs to your purchasers or recoup those additional costs in rent for a battery that's going to consume less energy, that's going to increase your capital cost up front. It's going to be hard to recover that cost, I think, just based on the current market pressures that we're seeing.
And I'll just add a couple of points. So on the EV charging piece, most of the smart EV charging systems that we're involved with in deploying have load sharing and automated load sharing technologies on them. So they're pretty efficient in terms of the number of EV chargers you can deploy with the existing electrical capacity within the building. Most buildings that we look at for EV charging can immediately deploy chargers without having to put additional infrastructure in terms of capacity at the building. And even if they are at the point where they do require additional capacity, the financials still make sense to add that capacity now, because you're going to be able to add a lot more chargers in the future. So that's sort of on the charging piece. On the ultra low overnight rate, the only issue with that, well, there's a number of issues which have been talked about. One of the biggest issues is, along with the 2.4 cent overnight rate, which is obviously super low, it comes with a much higher on-peak rate, which is 24 cents. So the on-peak price that comes with that rate structure means any energy that you're using during the on-peak time is very expensive. So battery technology, in terms of the economics, you really have to put enough battery capacity in place to completely offset the total on-peak load in order for the economics to make sense. And I think both Julian and Karim have stated, like, the cost of installing that amount of battery capacity today, even though you're avoiding a 24 cent per kilowatt hour on-peak charge, is the cost of those batteries plus the install to get the capacity you need. The economics just aren't there yet today. And then the other component we're certainly seeing is a much more higher level of cloud-based automation on overall building demand management. And that's going to become certainly more prevalent as more and more buildings become electrified, and the importance of sort of managing your load profile and what pieces of equipment can and cannot be used at certain times of the day, and integrating all of that into a sort of almost like a building automation system that you would typically see in HVAC, but just for electrical. And those types of software are coming out into the market now.
Peter, actually got another one for you that is somewhat related to this. Car charging, can that be added to the sub-metering bill? And also, as a follow-on to that, does your sub-metering process allow for time of use billing?
Yeah, so car charging can automatically get added directly to the resident's monthly bill based on actual consumption, which seems to be a fair and practical approach to car charging. They still have the ability for visitor or transient parking to be charged by the hour based on a credit card transaction. And in terms of the meters, yes, they are all time of use hourly interval meters. So we can apply time of use billing through the sub meters.
And just on that point, as management, we really like it when Peter and his team does the sub-metering, because let's just say the tenant who owns or the owner of the space wants to lease it to someone else. Someone else has got an electric vehicle and they want to switch places. It's very easy for the resident to call Wise and have them just switch that one particular sub-meter to another bill. So it adds a lot of flexibility. The other thing as managers we really like is the actual Measurement Canada regulated billing. So, they're actually being billed based on a kilowatt consumption hour. They're not being billed based on, oh, I'm getting charged $5 an hour. What's $5 an hour? That's not a per kilowatt hour. So from a management standpoint, we have a lot more comfort level when the sub-metering companies themselves are involved in the individual metering of EV charges, in addition to the in-suite consumption of utilities or geothermal energy.
Thank you both. That's great. There are a few questions that I could probably kind of group together that kind of speak to our our utility model, Subterra's utility model, energy as a service model, as well as the difference between that versus somebody going out and buying it, owning it themselves. Some questions around ITCs a little bit more specifically. These are all great questions. I would highly recommend that you reach out to us here at Subterra so that we can talk about these things on a project by project basis. I just don't think that I could do any justice whatsoever to showing you all a cost difference between our utility model versus owning it yourself for obvious reasons. So do reach out to us. These are conversations that we like to have all the time. Now, there are also some questions regarding how many universities have used geothermal heating and cooling or our services and such. Again, reach out directly to us, but I mean, we're working on a few right now, but those are stateside, they're not Canadian. In Canada, it seems that we've provided drilling for quite a few, but they're not on our utility model. Again, these are things that we can chat about, so please do reach out. And there's also a question regarding feasibility assessments for non-residential buildings. And what the best time would be for a non-residential building to approach us to incorporate geothermal heating and cooling in their design. I would say talk to us as soon as possible. Talk to us even when it's just you're in your due diligence phase, because we have a suite of in-house engineers. We run desktop feasibilities all the time, and at the very least, even if it doesn't go anywhere, we can guide you on what the outcome should be and answer the question in a very coherent manner backed by data. There's also a question regarding just how long we model our terms. It really depends project by project. I'd say most projects are probably in the 30 to 36 year range, but we have some projects at 40, some projects at 50. It really depends on the project. It's not a cookie cutter solution across the board, especially larger projects. There's just a lot more flexibility in that regard. I do have.
I just want to say thank you to Subterra for inviting us here, and Julian, thanks very much for your commentary. It's great to be on the panel with you as well, and happy to answer, available anytime, obviously with clients that have questions on geothermal and how it relates to sub-metering in your analysis on your developments.
Likewise, Peter and Julian, you two are both our stars today. We are very humbled to have you both here talking with us and speaking in general about how this industry is evolving and the services that are provided therein. We'd like to make sure that we are at the forefront of thought leadership in this regard, because regardless of what solution you pick, a solution for a renewable energy project within your developments is a solution for the future. So thank you all. Thank you both, especially for spending time with us and taking and educating us in this regard. And thank you to everyone who attended. We really do value your time. So thank you for spending it with us. Have a great day.
Thanks everybody. Bye-bye.